The courtroom fell into stunned silence as all eyes fixed on the young black teenager standing before the judge. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the scorn that had been heaped on her moments earlier. Judge Patterson, infamous for his sharp tongue and condescending attitude, had spent the last 20 minutes berating her, mocking her decision to represent herself in such a serious case. "You think you can fool this court?" he sneered, his laughter echoing through the room. "A child playing dress-up as an attorney? This is a courtroom, young lady, not a school play." Then she spoke. In a steady, clear voice, she began systematically dismantling the prosecution's case. Her deep knowledge of legal precedent and razor-sharp arguments left the judge and seasoned lawyers in the room dumbfounded. Gasps rippled through the audience as it became clear that this teenager was no ordinary defendant. The judge's smug expression faded, replaced by confusion and growing unease. "I object," one of the prosecutors interrupted, his face red with frustration. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe this. This individual is not who she claims to be." The teenager turned her piercing gaze toward the prosecutor and smiled faintly. "Your Honor, I can provide my credentials if necessary. But I assure you, every word I've spoken is legally sound. Shall we continue?" Judge Patterson's face turned a deep shade of crimson. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. The girl reached into her satchel, pulled out a pristine document, and handed it to the bailiff. The paper was passed to the judge. As he read it, his hands trembled. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The audience waited, breathless. Let's go back to where it all began. The story started in the quiet suburbs of Texas, where 17-year-old Cillier Benson lived with her grandmother, Jennifer. Cillier was no ordinary teenager. A child prodigy, she had been reading law books for fun by the age of 7 and debating college students by 12. Despite her brilliance, she preferred to keep a low profile, uninterested in the attention her intelligence might bring. Her grandmother, a retired schoolteacher, often reminded her of the importance of humility and using her gifts for good. One day, while helping her grandmother with groceries, Cillier overheard a conversation at the corner store. A local single mother, Rose, was in tears as she explained to the cashier that her landlord was evicting her and her 2 young children. "I don't have anywhere to go," Rose sobbed. "I've paid every cent on time, but he says I violated the lease." "I didn't. I swear I didn't." Cillier's heart sank. She approached Rose after the conversation and gently asked what had happened. Rose explained that her landlord claimed she had too many people living in the apartment. "It's just me and my babies," Rose insisted. "He's lying because he wants to raise the rent for someone else." Cillier's mind raced. She asked Rose if she had kept copies of her payments and lease agreement. Rose nodded, saying she had everything stored in a folder at home. "Let me help you," Cillier said firmly. "I think you have a case." Rose looked at her in disbelief. "But you're just a kid." Cillier smiled. "I've been told that before. Trust me." Over the next few days, Cillier pored over Rose's documents. The landlord's claims were riddled with inconsistencies. She wrote a formal letter demanding the landlord cease the eviction and threatening legal action if he didn't comply. When he ignored her, she helped Rose file a case in small claims court. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The teenager, who always had her nose in books, was now standing up for justice. The case caught the attention of local reporters, and Cillier's involvement became the headline of every small-town news outlet. But not everyone was impressed. Some questioned her qualifications, while others mocked the idea of a teenager taking on such a serious matter. As the court date approached, Rose became increasingly anxious. "What if we lose?" "I don't have money for a lawyer," Cillier reassured her, though deep down, she knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about Rose. It was about standing up to injustice and proving that age and skin color didn't determine capability. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Spectators, reporters, and even some lawyers had come to watch the child attorney in action. Cillier, dressed in a plain navy blazer and skirt, carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her years. As soon as she stepped forward to speak, Judge Patterson interrupted. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm representing the plaintiff, Your Honor," Cillier replied calmly. The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "You must be joking. Is this a prank?" The room filled with whispers and stifled laughter, but Cillier stood firm, her expression unchanging. Judge Patterson continued to ridicule her, questioning her credibility and making remarks about how kids these days didn't understand the seriousness of the law. Cillier endured it all silently, waiting for her moment to speak. When the opportunity finally came, she presented her case with precision and clarity, citing legal precedents and exposing the landlord's lies. The room grew quiet as she spoke, her words commanding attention and respect. But the moment that left everyone speechless came when she revealed her true identity: Cillier Benson, a certified legal prodigy who had passed the bar exam at just 16. She had kept this fact a secret until now. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Judge Patterson's gavel slammed against the bench. Just as Cillier was about to deliver the final blow to the prosecution's flimsy arguments, the judge leaned forward, his face pale. "This court is adjourned for a 10-minute recess," he stammered, clearly needing time to process what had just unfolded. Cillier's eyes followed him as he retreated to his chambers, and a small smile crept across her face. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with chatter as the recess began. Spectators leaned toward one another, whispering about the teenage attorney who had just stunned the judge and prosecution alike. Some marveled at her poise, while others were skeptical, insisting it had to be an elaborate hoax. Cillier remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Despite her composed exterior, her heart raced. She had revealed her credentials, a bold move, but one that came with risks. There was no turning back now. Rose leaned toward her, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Cillier, are you sure we're going to win this? They're acting like you're some kind of fraud." Cillier smiled softly. "Trust me," she said. The courtroom was silent as Rose whispered anxiously, "They're acting like you're some kind of fraud." Cillier turned to her, her voice steady and calm. "They're acting that way because they're afraid. The truth is on our side, Rose. Trust me." Before Rose could respond, the bailiff announced the judge's return. The room fell silent as Judge Patterson re-entered, his face unreadable. He took his seat and cleared his throat. "This court will now resume," he said, his voice firmer than before. His gaze shifted towards Cillier, but the arrogance from earlier was gone. "Miss Benson, the court acknowledges your credentials. You may proceed, but I advise you to tread carefully. You are still representing your client in a very serious matter." Cillier stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, her every movement deliberate. She could feel the weight of the stairs behind her, but she blocked it out, focusing on the task at hand. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to submit additional evidence that further undermines the defense's claims." She approached the bench and handed the judge a stack of documents, copies of emails between Rose and the landlord that contradicted his claims about lease violations. Cillier had highlighted key phrases in bright yellow to ensure nothing could be overlooked. Judge Patterson studied the documents in silence, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. Finally, he looked up and turned to the landlord's attorney. "Mr. Mark," the judge said sharply, "these emails directly contradict your client's testimony. Do you have an explanation for this?" The landlord's attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair, hesitated. "Your Honor, these emails could have been fabricated. We would need time to verify their authenticity." Cillier didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I anticipated that argument," she said, pulling out another sheet of paper. "Here is the chain of custody for these emails, including metadata verification from a certified digital forensics expert." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, prompting Judge Patterson to slam his gavel down. "Order." "I said order." Cillier returned to her seat, her confidence unshaken. The judge turned back to the landlord's attorney. "Mr. Mark, unless you can provide concrete evidence to refute this, I will have no choice but to consider these emails valid." The defense attorney stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, We need additional time to review. Denied. The judge interrupted, his tone icy. We've already spent too much time on this matter. Miss Benson, continue. Celia rose again, her voice unwavering as she outlined the timeline of events, linking the landlord's actions to clear violations of housing laws. She cited legal precedents one after another, each reinforcing Rose's case. At one point, the landlord himself, a burly man with a sour expression, leaned over to whisper furiously to his attorney. Celia noticed, but stayed focused, her arguments growing more persuasive with each passing minute. But then, something unexpected happened. As Celia began summarizing her final points, the landlord abruptly stood up, his face red with anger. She's lying, he shouted, pointing at Celia. This whole thing is a setup. There's no way a kid like her knows all this legal stuff. The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. Judge Patterson slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the noise. Order in the court. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds, or I will hold you in contempt. The landlord reluctantly sat, his chest heaving with fury. Celia took a deep breath, maintaining her composure despite the outburst. Your Honor, she said calmly, if Mr. Reynolds has any evidence to support his accusations, I invite him to present it. Otherwise, I request that the court focus on the facts. The judge nodded, his expression stern. Mr. Reynolds, you will remain silent unless called upon to speak. Miss Benson, you may continue. Celia concluded her presentation, delivering her closing remarks with the precision and authority of someone twice her age. When she finally sat down, a wave of relief washed over her, though she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The defense attorney called his next witness, a maintenance worker from the apartment complex who claimed to have seen multiple people entering and leaving Rose's unit. Celia listened carefully, jotting down notes as the man spoke. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness stand with a calm, measured stride. Mr. Morgan, she began, you testified that you saw multiple people entering and leaving Miss Carter's apartment. Can you specify how many people and when this occurred? The man hesitated. Maybe 4 or 5 people, and it was a couple of months ago. Celia nodded. A couple of months ago. Do you remember the exact dates? No, not exactly, he admitted. Did you report this to anyone at the time? Well, no, the man said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. It didn't seem like a big deal then. Celia's lips curved into a faint smile. So, to clarify, you're unable to provide specific dates or evidence to support your claim. Is that correct? The man frowned but nodded. Yeah, I guess so. Thank you, Mr. Morgan, Celia said, stepping away from the stand. As she returned to her seat, she glanced at Rose, who gave her a nervous but grateful smile. The rest of the day's proceedings were uneventful compared to the earlier drama, but tension hung thick in the air as the court adjourned for the day. Outside, reporters swarmed Celia and Rose, shouting questions and snapping photos. Celia shielded Rose as best she could, guiding her through the crowd. Back at home, Celia collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Jennifer placed a cup of tea in front of her and sat down. You were incredible today, her grandmother said softly. I'm so proud of you. Celia managed a tired smile.
Thanks, Grandma.
But it's not over yet. Tomorrow is going to be even tougher. Jennifer reached out and squeezed her hand. You've got this, Celia. Just remember why you're doing it. Celia nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. For people like Rose. For everyone who's been told they're not enough. The next morning, Celia arrived at the courthouse early, ready to face whatever came next. But as she walked through the doors, she was greeted by a sight she hadn't anticipated. 2 police officers standing near the entrance, speaking with the landlord. One of the officers spotted Celia and began walking toward her, a grim expression on his face. Miss Benson, he said, we need to talk. Celia froze for a moment, her mind racing. She scanned the officer's expression, searching for any hint of what this confrontation might be about. Rose, who had been walking a few steps behind her, caught up and immediately sensed the tension. Is there a problem, officer? Celia asked, keeping her voice steady. The officer glanced at the landlord, who was smirking smugly from across the lobby. "We've received a report from Mr. Reynolds," the officer said, "alleging that you falsified evidence in this case." Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Cillier's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "What evidence does he have to support it?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're not here to—" The officer's tone was steady, but his words were unsettling. "We're just doing our due diligence. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions." Across the room, the landlord's smug grin widened. Cillier met his gaze, her expression unflinching. Turning back to the officer, she replied calmly, "I understand. But I'd like to speak with my client and legal counsel before I go anywhere." The officer hesitated, then gave a curt nod.
"Fine.
"Don't take too long." Cillier leaned closer to Rose, speaking in a hushed tone. "This is a scare tactic. He's trying to rattle us because he knows his case is falling apart." Rose's voice trembled as panic crept in. "But what if they arrest you? What if they—" "They won't," Cillier interrupted firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and they have no proof otherwise. Stay calm, and don't say anything to the landlord or his attorney." Rose gave a reluctant nod. Cillier stepped away and quickly called her grandmother. Jennifer picked up on the first ring. "Cillier, is everything okay?" "Grandma, I need you to contact Mr. Joshua," Cillier said, referring to a retired attorney and family friend. "The landlord just made a false accusation against me, and the police want to question me." Jennifer's voice hardened with resolve. "Stay strong, sweetheart. I'll get in touch with him right away. Don't let them intimidate you." "I won't," Cillier promised before ending the call. She turned to the waiting officer. "I'm ready, but I want to make it clear that I've done nothing illegal. This is an attempt to intimidate me." The officer said nothing and gestured for her to follow. As they walked to the station, Cillier kept her head high, refusing to give the landlord the satisfaction of seeing her falter. At the station, she was led into a small interrogation room. It was bare, save for a metal table and 2 chairs. One of the officers sat across from her, placing a tape recorder on the table. "Miss Benson," the officer began, "you're not under arrest, but we need to ask you some questions about the evidence you submitted in court. Mr. Stephen claims it was fabricated." Cillier clasped her hands on the table, her composure steady. "The evidence I submitted is authentic. I have documentation to prove its validity, including a chain of custody report from a certified digital forensics expert." The officer's brow furrowed. "Do you have those documents with you?" "They're in my case file, back in the courtroom," Cillier replied. "You're welcome to review them." The officer leaned back in his chair. "Why would Mr. Stephen make these accusations if they weren't true?" "Because he's desperate," Cillier said bluntly. "His case is falling apart, and he knows it. This is his way of trying to discredit me and delay the proceedings." The officer regarded her silently, then stood. "Wait here." As he left the room, Cillier exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Despite her calm exterior, doubts flickered. What if this derailed the case? What if they believed the landlord's lies? The door opened, interrupting her thoughts. The officer returned, followed by Mr. Joshua. His sharp eyes and confident stride were instantly reassuring. He nodded at Cillier before addressing the officer. "I'm here as Miss Benson's legal counsel," Mr. Joshua said. "What exactly is the basis for this questioning?" The officer explained the landlord's accusations. Mr. Joshua listened intently, his expression unwavering. When the officer finished, Mr. Joshua leaned forward, his tone firm. "This is a baseless claim. If Mr. Stephen has evidence to support these allegations, let him present it. Otherwise, you're detaining my client without cause." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're not detaining her." "Then she's free to go," Mr. Joshua interrupted. "Unless you're planning to arrest her, this conversation is over." After a pause, the officer nodded reluctantly. "She's free to go, but we'll be following up on this." Cillier stood, her confidence restored. "I'll be happy to cooperate, within the bounds of the law." As they left the station, Mr. Joshua placed a reassuring hand on Cillier's shoulder. "You handled yourself well. But be careful. This landlord is playing dirty." Cillier nodded. I expected as much. Thank you for coming. Anytime, Mr. Joshua replied. Now go win that case. When Cillier returned to the courthouse, Rose rushed to her, relief evident on her face. Are you okay? What happened? They let me go, Cillier said. They didn't have anything to hold me on. Rose sighed in relief, though tension still lingered in her expression. What do we do now? We stick to the plan, Cillier said firmly. This is just another obstacle. We'll get through it. But it doesn't mean it's over. We still have to see how this plays out in court. Stay strong. We're closer than ever to the truth. That evening, Cillier returned home to regroup with her team. Aaron was already there, poring over his laptop, while Jennifer brewed tea in the kitchen. The atmosphere was a mix of tension and cautious optimism. Aaron glanced up as Cillier walked in. Did you see the news? He asked, turning his screen to show a headline. Landlord arrested amid fraud allegations. Cillier nodded, sitting down with a sigh. It's everywhere. But we can't get distracted. The focus now is protecting Rose and solidifying our case. Jennifer placed a cup of tea in front of Cillier and patted her shoulder. You're doing an amazing job, sweetheart. Just remember, the truth is your greatest weapon. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Reporters jostled for seats, and the buzz of anticipation filled the air. As the hearing began, Judge Patterson addressed the court. Given the arrest of Mr. Stephen and the federal investigation into his activities, this case has taken a significant turn. However, we must not lose sight of the matter at hand, Miss Carter's tenancy and the allegations of fraud brought against her. Cillier stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, in light of Mr. Stephen's arrest and the evidence we've presented, we request that the court dismiss the counterclaim against my client and rule in favor of Miss Carter, allowing her to remain in her home. Mr. Mark, visibly shaken, rose to respond. Your Honor, the allegations against my client are still under investigation. We request a continuance until the federal inquiry is complete. Judge Patterson shook his head. A continuance is unnecessary. This court has seen sufficient evidence to cast serious doubt on the credibility of Mr. Stephen and the claims against Miss Carter. The counterclaim is dismissed. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval. Rose clasped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. As for Miss Carter's tenancy, the judge continued, this court finds in her favor. The eviction notice is invalid, and she may remain in her home. The courtroom erupted in applause. Rose turned to Cillier, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. After the hearing, reporters swarmed Cillier and Rose as they exited the courthouse. Cillier spoke briefly, emphasizing the importance of standing up against injustice and thanking her team for their support. As the crowd dispersed, Cillier took a deep breath. The fight had been long and grueling, but justice had prevailed. She turned to Rose, who was smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. You did it, Rose said. Cillier shook her head. We did it. And as they walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the battle began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and resilience. Although the case wasn't automatically over, the developments meant they needed to be prepared for what came next. That evening, Cillier sat in the kitchen with Aaron and Jennifer, going over the events of the day. Aaron had been following the news, where articles about Stephen's arrest were spreading like wildfire. Looks like the feds have been investigating him for years, Aaron said, scrolling through his laptop. Tax fraud, wire fraud, tenant exploitation. This guy has been running schemes across the state. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. No wonder he was so desperate to silence Rose. Exposing this case probably tipped the scales for the investigators. Cillier nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. We need to prepare for tomorrow. Stephen may be out of the picture for now, but his attorney will likely try to push the countersuit forward. Aaron frowned. Even without Stephen, they're still trying to fight? Possibly, Cillier replied. But the judge knows the truth is on our side. We just have to make sure we stay ahead of them. The next morning, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The absence of Stephen was palpable, but his attorney, Mr. Mark, was present, looking more haggard than ever. Cillier and Rose took their seats, bracing themselves for whatever would come next. Judge Patterson entered and addressed the room. Before we proceed, I want to address the recent developments. The arrest of Mr. Stephen raises serious questions about the integrity of his case and the countersuit. However, this court still has a duty to evaluate all evidence before reaching a decision. Mr. Mark stood, his voice wavering. Your Honor, while my client is unavailable, I believe the countersuit should proceed based on the merits of our claims. Cillier stood in response. Your Honor, the countersuit has no merit. The fabricated evidence, Mr. Stephen's arrest, and his established history of misconduct all undermine any credibility the defense might have. The judge nodded slowly. Miss Benson makes a strong argument. However, I will allow the defense to present their case before issuing a ruling. Mr. Mark, you may proceed. Mr. Mark called his first witness, a tenant from another property owned by Mr. Stephen. The man claimed that Stephen had always been kind and fair, insisting that the accusations against him were misunderstandings. Cillier listened carefully, taking notes. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand confidently. Mr. Morgan, she began, you've testified that Mr. Stephen was a fair landlord. Can you confirm if you've ever had any disputes with him? The man hesitated. No, not personally. Have you ever been threatened with eviction or faced unexpected rent increases? Well, no, he admitted. Are you aware that Mr. Stephen owns multiple properties under different business names? The witness shifted uncomfortably. I've heard rumors. Cillier smiled faintly. Rumors can be telling, can't they? No further questions, Your Honor. As the day wore on, the defense's case began to crumble. Their witnesses offered little more than vague praise for Stephen, and none could refute the mounting evidence against him. By the afternoon, it was clear Mr. Mark was running out of strategies. When it was Cillier's turn to make her final argument, she stood with quiet confidence. Your Honor, she began, this case is about more than just my client. It's about standing up to those who abuse their power to exploit others. Mr. Stephen's arrest and the evidence we've presented leave no doubt about his actions. This countersuit is a desperate attempt to deflect blame, and it has no basis in truth. She turned to Rose, who was sitting nervously at the plaintiff's table. Miss Carter is a hard-working mother who has done nothing wrong. She deserves justice, and this court has the power to deliver it. As Cillier returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Mark. His shoulders were slumped, and he avoided her gaze. The judge took a long moment to review his notes before addressing the court. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear the countersuit lacks merit. This court dismisses the countersuit with prejudice and will proceed with the original case. A wave of relief washed over Cillier and Rose. The countersuit was officially dead, and the path to victory seemed clearer than ever. But just as the courtroom began to empty, a bailiff approached Cillier with a sealed envelope. This was just delivered for you, he said. Cillier opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the contents. It was a subpoena. Stephen's legal team had filed a motion to introduce new evidence, and the hearing was set for the next day. Her relief was short-lived. The fight was far from over. Cillier's heart sank as she read the subpoena. New evidence, she muttered, her mind racing with questions. What could Stephen's team possibly have left to present? And how could they have managed it with him behind bars? Rose, who had been basking in the judge's dismissal of the countersuit, noticed Cillier's expression shift. What is it? She asked nervously. Cillier handed her the document. They're filing a motion to introduce new evidence. We have a hearing tomorrow. Rose's face fell. New evidence? What else can they throw at us? Cillier put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Whatever it is, we'll be ready. This is just another desperate attempt to stall. That evening, Cillier returned home and immediately called Aaron. She explained the situation, and he was just as baffled as she was. New evidence? That's a bold move considering the mess they're in, Aaron said, typing furiously on his laptop. They've got to be banking on something big or they're bluffing. Either way, we can't take chances. Cillier replied, I need you to dig deeper into Stephen's legal team. See if they've been working with anyone new, especially since his arrest. I'm on it, Aaron said. I'll let you know what I find. The next morning, Cillier walked into the courtroom with her head held high, despite the uncertainty. Rose sat beside her, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. The room buzzed with anticipation, reporters and spectators eager to see what the latest twist would bring. Judge Patterson entered, his face unreadable. This court is now in session. Mr. Mark, you've requested to introduce new evidence. Please explain its relevance. Mr. Mark stood, holding a manila folder. His confidence seemed restored, and that worried Cillier. Your Honor, this evidence directly challenges the plaintiff's claims of financial hardship and speaks to her credibility. He handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Patterson opened it, his expression neutral as he examined the contents. Miss Benson, the judge said, have you had the opportunity to review this evidence? No, Your Honor, Cillier replied. This is the first time we're seeing it. Very well, the judge said. You'll have the chance to respond after Mr. Mark presents his case. Cillier braced herself as Mr. Mark addressed the court. Your Honor, these are signed affidavits from multiple witnesses who claim to have seen Miss Carter engaging in unreported business activities, including operating a cash-on daycare service from her apartment. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rose's face went white, and she turned to Cillier, shaking her head. That's not true, she whispered. I don't know what they're talking about. Cillier nodded, her mind already working to counter the claim. Don't worry, she whispered back. We'll handle this. Mr. Mark continued presenting the affidavits and photos that purported to show parents dropping off children at Rose's apartment. The defense argued that this income undermined her claims of financial hardship and raised questions about her credibility. When it was Cillier's turn to cross-examine, she approached the bench with her usual calm. Your Honor, may I examine these affidavits? The judge nodded, and the bailiff handed her copies of the documents. Cillier scanned them quickly, noting discrepancies in the signatures and vague language used by the witnesses. Mr. Mark, she began, can you confirm the identities of these witnesses and whether they've been deposed? Mr. Mark hesitated. They have not been deposed yet, but their affidavits are signed and notarized. Cillier smiled faintly. Notarized does not equal credible. Without depositions, we have no way of verifying the authenticity of these claims. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that these witnesses be made available for depositions before this evidence is admitted. The judge nodded. That's a reasonable request. Mr. Mark, arrange for your witnesses to be deposed by the end of the week. Until then, this evidence will not be considered. After the hearing, Cillier and Rose left the courthouse, the weight of the new allegations hanging over them. As they walked to the car, Rose finally broke down. Cillier, what if they believe this? She said, tears streaming down her face. I don't even know these people. How can I prove they're lying? Cillier hugged her tightly. We'll prove it, Rose. I promise. This is just another one of their games, and we're going to expose it. That evening, Aaron called with an update. Cillier, I found something interesting. One of the witnesses who signed those affidavits, she's connected to a company that has ties to Stephen's properties. Cillier's eyes narrowed. You mean she's on his payrolls? Not directly, Aaron clarified. But she worked for a property management firm that oversees some of his buildings. It's enough to raise questions about her impartiality. Cillier nodded, a plan forming in her mind. That's exactly what we need. Can you gather more details? Already on it, Aaron said. And get this, 2 of the other witnesses have connections to Harmony Solutions. I'm sending you everything now. Cillier smiled for the first time that day. Aaron, you're a lifesaver. The next morning, Cillier prepared her deposition strategy. When the witnesses were called in, she systematically dismantled their credibility. She presented Aaron's findings, showing their ties to Stephen and questioning their motivations for coming forward. One witness, visibly nervous, admitted under pressure that she had been paid to sign the affidavit. Another claimed to have no knowledge of the allegations, saying she had been told she was signing a petition about tenant rights. By the end of the depositions, it was clear that the new evidence was yet another fabrication. Cillier presented her findings to Judge Patterson, who was visibly unimpressed with the defense's tactics. "Mr. Mark," the judge said sternly, "this court has had enough of these baseless distractions. The evidence you've presented is inadmissible, and I'm considering sanctions against your client for attempting to mislead this court." Cillier and Rose exchanged relieved glances, but the victory was bittersweet. The length Stevens' team was willing to go made it clear that the battle wasn't over. They weren't done fighting yet. As the hearing adjourned, Aimee stepped outside into the crisp air, her resolve stronger than ever. But as she approached her car, a man in a dark suit stepped out of the shadows. "Miss Benson," he said, his tone icy. "A word of advice, back off. You don't know who you're dealing with." Aimee stared at him, her pulse quickening, but her voice didn't waver. "If that's a threat, you'll need to do better, because I'm not going anywhere." The man in the dark suit gave Cillier a chilling smile, his eyes narrowing. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded parking lot. Rose, who had just exited the courthouse, hurried over to Cillier. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Cillier replied, her eyes scanning the area. "But it's clear Stevens' team isn't just playing dirty. They're escalating." Rose's face was pale. "Cillier, this is getting dangerous. Maybe we should." "No," Cillier interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what they want. If we back down now, they win, and they'll keep doing this to other people." Rose nodded reluctantly, but the fear in her eyes remained. That evening, Aimee sat at her desk, replaying the encounter in her mind. The man's tone, his confident stride, and the vague but pointed threat, it all felt calculated. She called Aaron, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. "Hey, Cillier," Aaron answered. "What's up?" She recounted the parking lot incident, describing the man in detail. "I don't know who he is, but he's clearly connected to Steven or his team. Can you look into anyone new they might have hired?" Aaron sighed. "It's possible they've brought in private investigators or consultants. I'll dig around and see what I can find." "Thanks, Aaron," Cillier said. "Let me know if anything looks off. I've got a feeling this isn't over." The next morning, Cillier arrived at the courthouse early, determined to maintain control of the case. To her surprise, Judge Patterson called her into chambers before the session began. "Miss Benson," he said, his expression unusually grave, "I've received a letter from Mr. Stevens' attorney requesting to delay the proceedings indefinitely, citing his client's legal troubles and inability to participate." Aimee's brow furrowed. "Your Honor, this is another stalling tactic. The defense has repeatedly tried to derail this case. Granting them an indefinite delay would set a dangerous precedent." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I agree that the request is suspect, but the court must balance fairness with efficiency. Do you have a proposal for how we should proceed?" Cillier took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I request that the case move forward without further delays. If Mr. Steven is unavailable, his legal team can represent him based on the evidence already submitted." Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Very well. I'll deny the defense's request for an indefinite delay and set a final hearing date. Be prepared to present closing arguments next week." The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. When the session resumed, Mr. Mark, clearly unprepared for this development, scrambled to object, but the judge held firm. "This case has dragged on long enough," Judge Patterson declared. "Both sides will present closing arguments next week, and this court will issue a ruling after that." When court adjourned, Rose turned to Cillier, her voice filled with a mix of relief and anxiety.
"So, this is it?"
"It's almost over." Cillier nodded. "Almost. But we need to make sure our closing argument is airtight. This is our chance to seal the deal." That evening, Aaron called with an update. "Cillier, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "I found out who that guy in the parking lot was. His name is Lucas Harper, and he's a private investigator with a reputation for doing questionable work." "Questionable how?" Cillier asked, her stomach tightening. "Harassment, intimidation, planting evidence, you name it. He's been linked to several high-profile cases where the opposition suddenly dropped out after his involvement. Cillier exhaled sharply. So they're trying to scare us into quitting? Exactly, Aaron said. But here's the kicker. Harper is tied to another one of Reynolds' shell companies. They're paying him directly. MA's eyes narrowed. That's exactly the kind of pattern we need to show the judge. Can you send me everything you have on Harper's? Already on its way, Aaron replied. Just be careful, Cillier. This guy doesn't play by the rules. The next day, Cillier incorporated Aaron's findings into her case file. She knew presenting this information could be risky. Harper's presence wasn't directly tied to the case, but it painted a clear picture of Stephen's tactics and lack of credibility. As she worked, Rose called, her voice panicked. Cillier, something's wrong. A man came to my apartment today asking questions about you. What did he ask? Cillier asked, her pulse quickening. Things like how we met, why I trusted you, and if I thought you were capable of handling the case. He said he was a reporter, but something about him didn't feel right. Cillier clenched her jaw. That's Harper. They're trying to dig up dirt on me now. Don't answer any more of his questions, and let me know if he comes back, okay? Rose's voice shook. Cillier, this is getting scarier every day. What if they hurt someone? They won't, Cillier said firmly. We're not going to let them intimidate us. The following week, the courtroom was packed as Cillier and Mr. Mark prepared to deliver their closing arguments. The tension in the air was palpable, with reporters and spectators eager to see how the case would conclude. Mr. Mark went first, painting Stephen as a misunderstood landlord who had been unfairly targeted. His argument was filled with vague statements and emotional appeals, but it lacked substance. When it was Cillier's turn, she stood confidently, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, this case has always been about one thing, justice. The evidence presented over the course of this trial has exposed a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and exploitation by Mr. Stephen and his team. From fabricated financial records to witness intimidation, their tactics speak volumes about their credibility, or lack thereof. She paused, letting her words sink in. Rose Carter is a hardworking mother who has done nothing but fight for her right to live in peace. She deserves justice, and today, this court has the opportunity to deliver it. Cillier turned to her seat, her heart pounding as she sat beside Rose. The judge announced that he would issue a ruling in 3 days, and the courtroom slowly emptied. As Cillier and Rose walked to the parking lot, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Harper. You really don't know when to quit, do you? He said, his tone laced with menace. You're playing a dangerous game, kid. Cillier stopped, standing tall despite the fear that rippled through her. The only dangerous game here is the one you're playing, and you've already lost. Harper smirked. We'll see about that. Before Cillier could respond, headlights swept across the parking lot, and a black SUV pulled up. Harper turned and disappeared into the vehicle, leaving Cillier and Rose standing in the cold, silent night. 3 days later, the courtroom was packed again as Judge Patterson prepared to deliver his ruling. Cillier sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Rose sat beside her, holding her breath. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing all evidence and testimony presented in this case, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Rose Carter. The room erupted into applause and cheers, but the judge raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, this court will refer Mr. Stephen and his legal team for investigation into possible perjury, evidence tampering, and other misconduct. Tears streamed down Rose's face as she hugged Cillier. We did it, she whispered. You did it, Cillier smiled, her relief and pride mingling. But as she looked across the room and saw Mr. Mark hurriedly packing his briefcase, she knew one thing for certain. This victory was just the beginning of her fight for justice. The courtroom victory was monumental, but Cillier knew the fight wasn't truly over. As Rose hugged her, the relief was palpable, but a lingering sense of unease tugged at the edges of Cillier's thoughts. Stephen's arrest and the judge's ruling were victories, but they were only part of the battle. The broader system that allowed landlords like Stephen to exploit tenants still loomed large. That evening, As Celia returned home, her grandmother Jennifer was waiting with open arms. "You are incredible," Jennifer said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Celia smiled, the warmth of her grandmother's embrace momentarily easing the weight on her shoulders.
Thanks, Grandma.
"But I think this is just the start. There are so many others like Rose who don't have the resources to fight back." Jennifer nodded, her face thoughtful. "You've been given a gift, Celia. Maybe it's time to think about how you can use it to help more people." The next morning, Celia received a call from a local journalist. "Celia Benson," the voice on the other end said. "I'm Tyler Jackson with the Tribune. I'd love to do a feature on you, highlight your work on the Stephen case, and what it means for tenants' rights." Celia hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight and didn't particularly enjoy the attention, but she realized that sharing the story could inspire others to stand up for themselves. "Okay," she said cautiously, "but only if the focus stays on the case and the impact on tenants like Rose." "Absolutely," Tyler agreed. "Let's schedule an interview later this week." The article went live later that week, and it was more than Celia expected. The headline read, "Tenant Takes Down Corrupt Landlord, Sparks Hope for Tenants Everywhere." It detailed the trial, the tactics Stephen had used, and Celia's unrelenting fight for justice. The response was overwhelming. Celia received dozens of emails and messages from people across the country, many sharing their own stories of housing injustice. One email in particular stood out. "Dear Miss Benson, my name is Laura Gonzalez. I've been fighting a similar battle with my landlord for over a year. Your story gave me the courage to keep going. I was wondering if you'd be willing to advise me on my case? I can't afford a lawyer, but I could really use your help." Aimee stared at the email, her mind racing. She wanted to help, but she was just one person. How could she take on more cases while still keeping up with her studies and personal life? "Grandma," she said later that evening, "people are asking for my help. I want to do more, but I don't know how." Jennifer sat beside her, her expression wise and calm. "You don't have to do it alone, Celia. There are people out there who—" Celia spent the following weeks reflecting on how to expand the reach of her work. She reached out to local lawyers, community activists, and nonprofit organizations that focused on housing rights. Slowly but surely, a plan took shape, a grassroots initiative that would offer free legal aid to tenants facing eviction and exploitation. She called it the Justice Collective. Aaron eagerly joined the cause, excited to handle the tech side of things. "We'll set up a website, social media, everything," he said, his enthusiasm contagious. Rose, eager to give back after everything she'd been through, also volunteered. "You saved me, Celia," she said. "The least I can do is help you save others." Meanwhile, the fallout from Stephen's arrest continued to make headlines. Reports revealed he was facing additional charges like tax evasion and racketeering. Several of his properties were seized by authorities, and tenants who had been wrongfully evicted began speaking out. But not everyone was happy about Celia's growing influence. One evening, as she worked late at the newly established Justice Collective office, a small, donated space in a community center, her phone buzzed. With an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered. "Miss Benson," said the low, menacing voice on the other end. "You think you've won, but you don't understand how deep this goes. Walk away while you still can." Celia's grip tightened on the phone.
"Who is this?"
The caller chuckled darkly. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how to make problems disappear. Consider this your last warning." The line went dead. Heart racing, Celia immediately called Aaron and told him about the threat. "That's insane," Aaron said. "We need to report this to the police." Celia hesitated. "Say what?" "That an anonymous caller told me to stop helping people? Without proof, they won't do anything." Aaron insisted, "You shouldn't take this lightly. You're getting under someone's skin, and they're scared of what you're building." Taking a deep breath, Celia's resolve hardened. "Then I must be doing something right." As the Justice Collective gained traction, more families came forward with stories of landlords manipulating leases and tenants feeling powerless. The movement began to grow, with volunteers stepping up to support the cause. But the threats didn't stop. Strange cars appeared near her house, and once, She found a threatening note taped to her door. "Quit while you can." One evening, as she left the office, she spotted Lucas Harper waiting outside. Leaning casually against a lamppost, his smirk was as infuriating as ever. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said as she approached. "But you're poking at things that don't like to be poked." Cillier squared her shoulders. "I'm not afraid of you." Harper chuckled. "Maybe you should be. People like me, we don't lose." "Neither do I," Cillier shot back, brushing past him. The threats only fueled her determination. By the end of the year, the Justice Collective had helped dozens of families avoid eviction and exposed several unethical landlords. Cillier's story spread, inspiring others to fight back against injustice. But she knew the fight wasn't over. The deeper she dug, the more corruption she uncovered. With every victory, the threats against her escalated. Anonymous letters, late-night phone calls, and the ever-present shadow of Lucas Harper reminded her she was facing an adversary much larger than she had ever anticipated. One evening, after wrapping up a seminar at a local community center, Cillier received an urgent call from Aaron. "Cillier, we've got a problem," Aaron said, his voice tense. "I've been tracking some unusual activity tied to Reynolds' old network. There's a massive real estate deal happening tomorrow, involving one of his shell companies, Harmony Solutions, and a group of investors with a shady track record." Cillier frowned. "What's the deal?" "They're planning to buy up a block of low-income housing, evict everyone, and flip it into luxury condos. It's a textbook gentrification scheme, and they're using Stephen's playbook. If this goes through, dozens of families will be displaced." Her stomach twisted. "Do we have enough evidence to stop it?" "Not yet," Aaron admitted, "but I know where the signing is happening. If we disrupt the meeting and expose their plans, we might be able to stop it." The next morning, armed with documents Aaron had uncovered, Cillier, Aaron, and Rose arrived at the downtown office building where the meeting was set to take place. As they entered, Cillier spotted Lucas Harper leaning against a wall near the elevator. He smirked when he saw her. "You're persistent."
"I'll give you that," he said.
"But you're way out of your league this time." Cillier stepped closer, her voice cold. "Maybe. Or maybe you and your friends are finally about to lose." Harper chuckled. "Good luck. You'll need it." Cillier ignored him and continued to the conference room where the deal was set to be signed. Through the glass walls, she saw a group of men in suits gathered around a table, documents spread before them. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The room fell silent as the investors turned to look at her. "Can we help you?" one of them asked, his tone laced with irritation. Cillier held up a folder. "I'm here to stop you from destroying people's lives." The men exchanged amused glances, but Cillier pressed on. She placed copies of Aaron's findings on the table and began explaining how the deal relied on fraudulent practices. "This deal isn't just unethical, it's illegal," Cillier said. "And if you move forward with it, we'll make sure the world knows exactly what you're doing." The tension in the room was palpable. One of the investors muttered, "We need to discuss this privately." Another, less shaken, leaned forward. "You have no authority here, kid. Get out before we call security." Cillier stood her ground. "You can call security if you want, but the evidence is already on its way to the media and the Attorney General's office. This meeting is over." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of the older investors sighed and stood up. "She's right. We can't take this risk. We're pulling out." The others followed suit, some grumbling, others glaring at Cillier as they filed out of the room. Lucas Harper appeared in the doorway, watching with a mixture of annoyance and admiration. "You really don't quit," he said. Cillier turned to him, her voice steady. "Not when people's lives are at stake." Harper's smirk faltered for the first time. He gave her a small nod, almost respectful, before walking away. The story of Cillier's showdown at the investor meeting spread quickly, solidifying her reputation as a fearless advocate for justice. The Justice Collective received an outpouring of support, with donations and volunteers flooding in. The block of housing she had saved became a symbol of hope, and tenants began organizing their own efforts to protect their rights. But Cillier knew the fight was far from over. She had learned that the system was deeply flawed, And for every landlord like Stephen or investor scheme she exposed, there were more waiting in the shadows. One evening, as she sat with Jennifer and Rose, Celia reflected on the journey so far. "It feels like we're just scratching the surface," she said. "There's so much more to do." Jennifer smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've already made a difference, Celia. And you're inspiring others to stand up, too. That's how real change begins." Rose nodded. "You gave me my life back. You're doing more than just fighting cases. You're giving people hope." Celia smiled, a sense of purpose washing over her. "Then I guess we keep going." Years later, Celia Benson would become a renowned attorney and activist, leading a nationwide movement for tenant rights and housing reform. The Justice Collective expanded into a powerful organization, helping thousands of families and rewriting laws to protect the vulnerable. And though the threats never fully disappeared, Celia never wavered. She had learned that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Because for every person like Rose Carter who found their voice, the world became a little brighter. Celia's story became a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference, and that the fight for justice was always worth fighting.